This project is not very complex and it does not require a real detailed design, but it's always nice to see things in actual size. So I've drawn out a couple circles here representing the donut that I'm going to turn. This donut is going to be comprised of 8 gigantic segments. Those segments will be a construction of many different layers of wood. So I've got my basic shape here, or design, the dimensions. The clock faces go in the ends of each one of these. I've gone through my wood scrap pile and collected all kinds of wood, various species and so forth. My only limitation was I didn't take wood that was less than an inch wide. I've ripped pieces out of all that scrap and created these piles of material about an inch wide. I drum sanded all the surfaces to 80 grit. The thicknesses varied from about 1/8 of an inch to over 1/2 an inch. Now going back to my plan, there's my length, 6 3/4. My width is more than the 4-inch donut because of the curve. To construct this donut, I need a lot of laminated material. So I'm gluing together these various strips, different widths, different species. A lot of glue there, requires a lot of clamps, requires a lot of quick work to get it all squeezed out, keeping it relatively flat. Here's 4 of the 8 laminations that I put together. After these are milled, they'll be a little less than an inch thick and about 4 3/4 inch wide. Here's some material that I've salvaged that'll act as the center of these laminations. So there's my 2 dimensions, the length and the width. What about the height? Well, the donut has to be 4 inches in diameter, so I'll only need a 4-inch tall ring. I'm going to take this material and surround it with laminated material. So I'm cleaning up the glue squeeze out as best I can, doing a couple passes through the joiner, then through the planer, and then back over to the drum sander to get perfect 80 grit surfaces on both sides of these laminations. And then I want smaller material, thinner material, so I'm doing a technique on the table saw, making 2 passes, same side to the fence in each pass, followed by a cut with the bandsaw, then back to the drum sander to get rid of that center core. So I've got all this great looking material. They're smooth on both sides. I'm cutting them to length at about 7 1/4 inches. Now the next step is to start joining this to the core material. The glue seams have to be perfect. There's no opportunity to go back and fix something later. Quite frankly, my 12-inch disc sander is a little undersized for this kind of work. To be honest about it, I did most of this type of sanding on my 20-inch sander, but it could be done with a 12-inch. The next step is to start surrounding the center piece of wood. So I've just laid a piece on there, marked it about a 1/16 of an inch or so wider, done a series of rip cuts so that I've got a piece that can be put on the sides of each one of these 8 center pieces. It's a long, lengthy process. Compared to putting rings together, there's a lot of surface area here, which is why I'm using so many clamps. Here's the sequence once more. After a glue job, I clean up glue. I prepare a straight side, a straight surface, not necessarily a flat surface, but a straight surface, and then a flat surface. Now I've got a flat surface that can go on my table saw table, and I've got a straight surface that can go against the fence. Adjusting the fence allows me to make 2 passes, get 2 really smooth sides, opposite sides, which require minimal sanding. Now I can go at this with 2 more pieces at the same time on opposite sides. This speeds up the process, being able to put them on 2 at a time. Plenty of clamps, and just using my fingertips, keeping those layers parallel to one another. During all these steps, I created a lot of cutoffs, and I didn't want those to go to waste, so as I go along, I just rejoin those together to generate more laminated material that can be used. Here's my current progress, and after thinking about it, I've decided to shrink the final diameter from 4 inches down to 3 3/4. By shrinking the diameter, all I've done is reduce the perimeter around the clock faces. So I've made a midstream design change. The width now will be 4 1/4 and the height 3 3/4. The length, well, I can decide upon that later. So it's back to trimming and gluing and so forth. There's really no way to speed this up. It's a long process. A nudge of the fence, a trim, a little sanding. Here's one of the glue steps. This will tax your inventory of clamps. Here's the current progress. These are getting ready for one more addition. And then the final trim to get them all the same height and all the same width. After some testing, I've got this dialed in at 22.5. I'll make one cut on one end of all of them. So now I've established a stop block. I'm going to cut these about 6.5 inches long. It's a really slow cut. You cannot rush that blade through that much hard wood. Just take it easy, nice slow cut. A dry fit here confirms that I was dead on, or pretty close to. These seams do not have to be perfect because we're going to cut this apart later. Lots of glue, 3 hose clamps around this will secure it while the glue cures. I'll put this aside and let it cure for at least 2 or 3 hours. Overnight would be better. Now to mount it, I've taken the clamps off. A little bit of handwork here to make sure there's no high spots so it's relatively smooth. I've mounted a piece of MDF on a faceplate and turned it to the exact diameter of the outside points. Now I need to align this with those points as perfectly as I can eyeball and feel, clamp it in place, and then drill 8 holes at the 8 corners, staying pretty close to the extreme tip. I can drill in those tips because later on that'll all get turned away. Always put a reference mark when you're doing that kind of work. I'm enlarging the holes a little bit, get it nice and clean. 8 screws will secure that to this plate of MDF. Onto the lathe I can go. Now the real fun can start. It's a chore to get it round, but that's the first goal. I'm staying away from those screws, obviously. Once I get it round, I want to check my dimensions, inside, outside, and the thickness. The 2 dimensions are already within about 1/10 of an inch, so I'm in pretty good shape in that regard. So I'm going to create a template that'll measure 3.7 inches, the inside diameter of this little ring of wood. Using a section of that ring as a template, it's a matter of turn a little and check frequently, back and forth. Those pencil lines are the center of the dimension in each direction, so I don't want to take any wood there. So far so good, so it's time for the next step. Off this goes, a new jam chuck to hold the inside. Just a stack of MDF turned to fit, very snugly on the inside of the donut. And I knocked the corners off since I had the ability to do so. Now I knock this on. It holds it pretty snugly. A couple beads of hot melt don't hurt. And it's another series of turn a little, check, turn, check, back and forth. Just trying to get that arc all the way around to conform to the template. This type of tool comes in handy, just checking diameters in different directions. And here again the template. So with that looking good, I need to be able to get the very inside of this turned a little more. So a giant external jam chuck has been built. I'm cutting a slot here which will give me access and the ability to pry it out of the jam. There's just a little bit of wood that needs to be removed on the inside of this. And then I can also use this to hold it while I sand this side, and I can turn it around, sand the other side. I'm going to sand everything up to 400 grit. Here you can see I've used a piece of foam rubber and a big screwdriver to pry that out, flipping it over so I can sand the other side. Now I'm back to the other jam. Because I removed wood on the inside of the donut, I had to put in about 5 layers of duct tape in order to tighten up that fit. That doesn't have to be perfect, it was just for sanding purposes. Over to the bandsaw, cutting this part into the 8 sections right on the glue seams. The next chore is these 16 ends, the 8 tops and 8 bottoms. Well, I devised this jig on my lathe. It's just a construction of MDF, some screws and bolts that will allow me to turn those 2 ends. After determining the center point, using that point along with my tailstock allows me to center this and clamp it in place with these 2 bolts. It takes a little trial and error. I'm using a pencil just to see if I got it as true as possible before flattening it with whatever tool you like to use. This is very hard ingrain. I'm using a Forstner bit in my tailstock to remove the wood on the inside. This is relatively slow speed turning of very hard ingrain. Getting the fit for the clock mechanism just right requires a lot of turn a little and check, turn and check, back and forth. There are 4 spring-loaded prongs that hold the mechanism in place, so you got to get that diameter just about right. Once that's achieved, some sanding, and then I'm going to take some 400 grit here and just round that sharp edge, turn it around, and do the same thing to the bottom, except the bottom doesn't have to have the hole drilled or turned. A couple of decorative grooves finishes off the bases, then I can sign them and put finish on. I'm using a wipe-on poly, although with hindsight I might have been better off with a spray lacquer. There's a little bit of rosewood in these, which slows down the drying process of the poly. For buffing in between coats, I'm using a 400 grit sanding mop. After the last buffing, it's just a matter of snapping the faces into place. Don't forget to set the time and put a battery in. There's a lot of work in these, but at least you get 8 clocks at the same time. A lot of glue seams, a lot of wood. You also have the option of purchasing a smaller clock face. You can see this is quite a bit smaller. This one here is from a batch of 8 clocks that I did over 10 years ago. The date on the bottom, 1999. It's held up very, very well. There's no ridges, no defects in the glue seams. Everything's going the same direction. But there are multiple species, but it's all held together very, very nicely. So think about this as an option. If you don't have enough wood or the time to put such a large donut together, just shrink the donut size down and make one using the smaller faces. Have fun with this project. If you think back to when I cut the large segments on the big chop saw, I created these cutoffs, these end pieces at an angle. Well, it's really good material. It's got all this exotic wood. Be ashamed to throw it in the wood stove. Follow along in the next lesson and I'll show you what I did with these cutoffs.